Luciano Mancini's book, La ricetta della felicità, invites us into a journey that is neither a lecture nor a set of instructions, but a gentle unfolding. It speaks to the human being who wakes in the morning, unsure whether joy is something earned, deserved, or perhaps merely remembered. In a world where everyone seems to pursue something, success, recognition, escape, Mancini asks a quieter question. What if the happiness we chase is already here, waiting? His work is not a philosophical monolith, but a live testimony. It blends moments, travels, faces, and small details that otherwise disappear unless someone teaches us to look. And so, this book becomes a mirror, asking us if we are walking toward happiness or walking away from ourselves. Russell, in The Conquest of Happiness, once wrote that happiness is tied to interests outside the self, that a mind turned outward becomes lighter, more fulfilled. Mancini's approach is different and yet parallel. He turns inward, not to retreat, but to reclaim. In his pages, the enemy is not the world nor other people, but the ego, that restless whisper that always says, not enough, not yet, not you. Where Russell diagnoses, Mancini confesses. Where Russell proposes habits of life, Mancini proposes a return to essence. The two voices do not argue. Rather, they meet like two rivers, showing that happiness requires both directions, to expand into the world and to descend into the soul. The book speaks through experience, through airports, cities, people known and forgotten, but most of all through the author's encounters with himself. We follow him on journeys where the external scenery becomes a metaphor, mountains mirroring the high places of spirit, seas reflecting our emotional tides, crowded streets echoing the noise inside our minds. Mancini reminds us that traveling far does not guarantee arriving anywhere. Many people board airplanes only to land back inside the same thoughts. True arrival, he writes between his lines, is when you meet yourself without fear or excuses. Here, the teaching of Heidegger appears naturally without being named. The here and now, Dasein, is not a timestamp but a state of being. To exist fully means to occupy this present moment, not merely pass through it. So many live as drafts of their own life, postponing themselves, saving joy for later, as though later is promised. Mancini tears that veil apart. If happiness is real, it must be real in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this blink. There is no other place where it could ever exist. Tomorrow contains only imagination. Yesterday is only memory. But now is alive. Seneca once advised retreating into oneself and seeking companions who elevate and offering elevation in return. Mancini embodies this Roman wisdom in accessible language. The happiness he suggests is not isolated hermitage, but shared resonance. The ego separates, competes, compares. The true self, the deep self, collaborates, teaches, learns. In Seneca's spirit, Mancini reminds us that helping someone else stand often becomes the very moment when we discover our own strength. Teaching makes us students again. Giving makes us richer. To improve another life is to witness ourselves improving. In Mancini's narrative, the ego is a saboteur made of illusions. It promises happiness only through conditions: when I get this job, when I'm admired, when I win, when others see me. But as soon as one condition is met, the ego invents another and another until life becomes a treadmill. The ego lives in scarcity. It never considers you complete. The real self, however, speaks another language, the one of acceptance, expansion, breathing. It whispers that happiness is a choice, repeated daily, sometimes hourly, especially on difficult days. Happiness becomes a practice, not a prize. Osho once said, "You are not your thoughts." Mancini echoes this, not through doctrine but through story. Thoughts pass like clouds. Ego builds storms. But consciousness, the witness beneath, is the sky. When we forget this, life becomes a battlefield of internal narratives. When we remember it, life returns to being a landscape to walk through. Happiness, then, is a shift of identification, from voice to silence, from noise to source. Mancini gives examples through conversation, travel, introspection, and the listener senses that happiness is not an achievement but a surrender. What then is the recipe? Mancini reduces thousands of pages of philosophy, psychology, and spirituality to a four-letter word: love. Not romance, not possession, not need, but love as a generative force, a frequency. Love for oneself, without ego. Love for others, without attachment. Love for life, without fear. In this sense, love is not an emotion. It is a state of alignment. When our conscious mind and subconscious mind no longer contradict each other, but walk in the same direction, the world feels lighter. The internal civil war ends. Love becomes a truce inside the soul. Alignment between conscious and subconscious, a theme echoed by modern motivators, neuroscientists, and spiritual teachers, becomes a bridge to an easy life. An easy life is not a life without challenge. It is a life where challenge does not break coherence, where you respond rather than react, where you choose rather than obey your impulses. When Mancini writes of happiness, he is writing of freedom, neither freedom from nor political freedom of, but interior freedom, the ability to remain yourself in any circumstance. There is also a thread of Stoicism running through his reflections: to stand firm, even when life bends, to welcome reality without demanding it be different, to see hardship as material for building character. Happiness, in Mancini's vision, does not deny suffering. Instead, it asks, who will you become because of it? The ego demands comfort. The self demands growth. This distinction shifts everything. Imagine now the modern reader, exhausted, scrolling, overstimulated, searching for happiness like someone searching pockets for keys. Mancini gently touches their shoulder and says, "What if you already have them?" His writing is not an answer but an awakening. He does not offer commandments. He offers remembering. And remembering is an act the reader must do alone. Happiness cannot be imported. It must be discovered like a familiar song you forgot you knew. Travel in the book often becomes a metaphor for inner relocation. Mancini might stand on a cliff, and instead of describing its height, he speaks of the clarity that arises when nothing obstructs your view. He might sit in an airport and realize how many people wait, always wait, for something before living. Waiting becomes the antagonist. Living becomes the rebellion. And happiness, perhaps, is the moment when you stop waiting. The rhythm of Mancini's book is reflective, like breath. It invites pauses. It encourages slowing. And in that slowing, the truth appears. Happiness is subtle. It arrives quietly. It sits in morning light, in conversations, in forgiveness, in saying, "I'm here." Mancini writes as someone who has been far from himself and has returned. That return is the lesson. Compared to Russell's rational clarity, Mancini uses vulnerability. Russell diagnoses, Mancini confesses. Russell argues with intellect. Mancini invites with heart. Together they form a complete philosophy that happiness demands both thought and soul, both expansion outward and descent inward. Wisdom is not either or, it is and also. For a world obsessed with measuring life, followers, wealth, likes, Mancini measures differently. Presence, depth, connection. He would ask not how many know your name, but how many know your essence. He would ask not whether you have succeeded, but whether you have lived. The book shares unspoken truths, that silent companionship, a shared gaze, a moment of honesty can sometimes deliver more joy than any milestone. Ego wants applause. The soul wants recognition, not by crowds, but by one true moment. And happiness often hides inside that single moment. There are passages where Mancini describes being lost, uncertain, or scared. These parts matter more than the conclusions, because they show that happiness is not born from perfection, but compassion toward oneself. To be human is to be unfinished. To be happy is to accept the unfinishedness without shame. Listening to Mancini, you realize happiness might be less about answers and more about questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I need truly? What do I fear losing? And why do I fear it all? These questions, if lived rather than solved, lead somewhere sacred. When he writes of love as the key, one understands love not as softness, but as strength. Love is the courage to remain open. Love is the discipline to be true. Love is the intelligence to see beyond fear. Happiness, therefore, is not passive. It is an act of inner leadership. Mancini's reflections often imply that when the ego dissolves, the world changes because perception changes. A crowded street becomes a mosaic of lives, not an obstacle. A problem becomes a teacher, not a threat. In this shift, happiness becomes not a treasure buried under circumstances, but a light switched on by awareness. Imagine standing before a mirror, looking at yourself. Ego sees flaws. Soul sees story. Ego sees what is missing. Soul sees what is possible. Mancini writes for the part of you that sees possibility. And if happiness is discovered, not earned, then gratitude becomes its guardian. Gratitude trains the mind to notice. It holds life gently. It says, nothing is guaranteed, and that is why everything is precious. Gratitude, like love, is a practice. In reading Mancini, one senses community, even in solitude. He writes like someone sitting beside you. His tone is never superior. His journey is shared, not preached. And so, the reader does not feel instructed. They feel accompanied. This companionship reflects Seneca's wisdom. Surround yourself with those who make you better, and welcome those you can improve. Mancini, through writing, becomes such a companion, and reading him is itself a practice of reciprocal elevation. Now imagine applying his message, waking each day and asking not, what must I do, but who will I be? Shifting life from a checklist to an expression, replacing pressure with presence. That is Mancini's promise, not that life becomes easier, but that life becomes yours. And so, happiness, under his pen, becomes sovereignty, a quiet claim of one's existence. The world can storm, circumstances can bend, but the inner axis remains. To close, consider this. Perhaps happiness is not a destination nor a secret. Perhaps it is an identity, something you remember, something you decide, something you allow. And maybe, just maybe, Mancini's recipe is not a recipe at all, but a reminder that love is the beginning, the middle, and the return. This is the secret to an easy life.